I was broke and desperate. Then my landlord made a shocking offer that changed everything. I never thought desperation could push me this far. Never. But when life backs you into a corner, when the bills pile up, when your stomach twists in hunger, when the people who promise to love you barely notice you exist, you start seeing things differently. You start considering things you swore you never would. I was broke. Completely. I don't mean, oh, things are tight this month, broke. I mean staring at eviction notices, hearing my phone buzz with debt collectors, counting coins just to buy a loaf of bread kind of broke. And on top of that, I was lonely. Not just physically, but the kind of loneliness that crawls under your skin and makes you feel invisible. Like you could disappear and no one would even notice. My husband, if you could even call him that at this point. We lived under the same roof, but it felt like we were miles apart. He barely spoke to me anymore. Barely looked at me. The warmth, the love, the connection, it was all gone. And then there was him. My landlord. Tall. Strong. Charismatic in a way that made you uneasy but intrigued at the same time. The kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence, like he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. He was always polite, always professional, until one day, he wasn't. Until one day, he made me an offer that left me speechless. An offer so shocking, so unbelievable, that for a split second, I actually considered it. And that's when I knew. I had already crossed a line. Not physically, not yet. But in my mind, in my heart, something inside me had already shifted. And it terrified me. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely trapped? Where the lines between right and wrong weren't so clear anymore? Where desperation whispers things in your ear that you never thought you'd listen to? Because if you have, then you might understand why I did what I did. And if you haven't, well, you're about to find out. Before I tell you the full story, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga now. It helps the channel grow. And turn on your post notification, because trust me, this is just the beginning. My name is Emily. I'm 32 years old, and if you had asked me a year ago if I'd ever betray my marriage, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I still believed in love. In loyalty. In the kind of marriage where you fight for each other, not with each other. But that was before the silence. Before the loneliness. Before I became nothing more than a ghost in my own home. Festus, my husband, wasn't always like this. There was a time when he used to look at me like I was the most beautiful thing in the world. When his touch felt like home. But somewhere along the way, that man disappeared. Now, he barely spoke to me. When he did, it was short. Cold. Like I was an obligation rather than a woman he once swore to love. He worked late. Always on his phone. If I asked for help with the bills, his response was always the same, I'm trying. Stop stressing me. But the thing is, I wasn't just stressed. I was drowning. The bills kept stacking up. The rent was overdue. The fridge was empty more often than it was full. And Festus? He didn't care. I cried myself to sleep more nights than I could count. And then, there was Mr. Edison. My landlord. The first time I met him, I was intimidated. He was tall, well-built, and carried himself with a confidence that made it impossible to ignore him. At first, he was just a landlord, strict, professional, always about business. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. I started catching him looking at me for just a little too long. His voice softened when he spoke to me. And then there were the small things, a hand lingering on mine for a second too long when I passed him the rent, the way his eyes traced my face like he was searching for something. It wasn't just in my head. I felt it, and I knew I should ignore it. I should look away, but I didn't, because for the first time in a long time I felt seen. Then came the final eviction notice. 3 months behind on rent. A red warning stamped across the page. I held it in my hands, feeling sick. That night, I begged Festus to help. Told him we were out of time. He barely looked up. What do you want me to do? I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat there, staring at a man who was supposed to be my partner, my protector. And I realized something that night. I was alone. The next morning, I went to Mr. Edison, ready to beg for more time. My hands were shaking when I knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, his dark eyes scanning my face. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me. And then, in that deep, steady voice, he said, "There's another arrangement we could make." I felt my stomach drop. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I understood exactly what he meant. And the worst part? A part of me, a small, dangerous part of me, was tempted to say yes. I stood there, my breath shallow, my fingers tightening around the eviction notice. Another arrangement? The words hung between us, thick, heavy. Mr. Edison didn't blink. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. My heart pounded. I knew what he was saying. I knew it, but I couldn't bring myself to react. So I did the only thing I could. I laughed. A small, nervous sound. Forced. Hollow. I don't understand. He tilted his head, his lips barely curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. You do. A slow, deliberate pause. A silence so dense it felt like the walls were closing in. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. This was my landlord. The man who held my home, my security, in his hands. The man who had always been polite, professional, until now. I should have been disgusted. I should have walked away. But I didn't. Because somewhere, buried beneath the shock, was something darker. Curiosity. Not just about what he meant. About him. About what it would feel like if I crossed a line I never imagined myself crossing. I hated myself for that thought. I forced my voice to stay steady. I just need more time. He nodded slowly, but his eyes never left mine. I understand. But time doesn't pay bills. The air between us was charged, almost suffocating. I had a choice. I could end this conversation. I could walk out, pretend I misheard him, pretend my heart wasn't hammering in my chest for reasons I didn't want to admit. But I stayed. And that was the moment everything started to spiral. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning in endless loops. I should have been disgusted. I should have been angry. I should have felt anything other than what I was feeling. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Would I really go that far? Would I let myself become that woman? The thought should have made me sick. Instead, it lingered, wrapping around me like a slow, forbidden poison. I wasn't blind. I knew what Mr. Edison was offering. He never said the words, but he didn't have to. And I had considered it. Because at that moment, standing in front of him, feeling the weight of his stare, I hadn't just been thinking about rent. I had been thinking about the way his voice dropped lower when he spoke to me. About the way his eyes lingered, like he saw me, really saw me, in a way Festus never did anymore. That thought burned with guilt. But so did the excitement. I rolled onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut. No. I couldn't think like this. I was married. I made vows. Even if those vows felt like they didn't mean anything anymore. Even if I was already alone. I turned to look at Festus, lying next to me, his back facing mine. He didn't move. Didn't stir. Just laid there, breathing evenly, lost in whatever world existed in his dreams. A world where I didn't exist. I could disappear, and he wouldn't notice. The thought landed heavy in my chest. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. Tomorrow I'd talk to him. Tell him we were out of options. That we needed to figure something out together. Tomorrow, he'd prove to me that we were still in this together. That I wasn't as alone as I felt. Tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow came. And nothing changed. I sat across from Festus at breakfast, pushing my food around my plate. I could hear the sound of his spoon scraping against the ceramic, the soft hum of his phone vibrating on the table. I hesitated. Then I forced the words out. We need to talk about the rent. Nothing. He scrolled, barely acknowledging me. I tried again. Festus, I'm serious. We're 3 months behind. We have nowhere near enough. I'm handling it. Flat. Emotionless. I let out a slow breath. Handling it how? Do you have the money? No response. I felt something in me snap. Festus, do you even care? He finally looked up. Just for a second. Then he sighed and rubbed his temple. Emily, what do you want me to say? I want you to care. I want you to act like I matter. I want you to hold me and tell me it's going to be okay. But I said none of that, because I already knew the answer. So I just shook my head, pushed my plate away, and left the table. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked away. And as I did, one thought whispered in the back of my mind. He'll never notice if I'm gone. The next few days passed in a haze. The same routine. The same silence. The same feeling of being invisible in my own home. But something had changed. I had changed. Because now, I wasn't just drowning in my loneliness, I was aware of it. Hyper-aware. It sat heavy in my chest, pressing down on me every time Festus barely acknowledged my presence. Every time he chose his phone, his work, his empty, half-hearted excuses over me. And then there was Mr. Edison. I started seeing him everywhere. At first, I told myself it was just coincidence. That I was only noticing him more because of what he had said. But deep down, I knew better. Because every time I left the apartment, it was like he was waiting. The first time, I was heading to check the mailbox when his deep voice stopped me in my tracks. Morning, Emily. I turned, and there he was. Leaning against his truck, arms crossed over his chest, watching me. My stomach flipped. I forced a smile. Morning. He didn't say anything else, just let his gaze linger a second too long before nodding slowly. I walked away too quickly. But after that, it kept happening. Every day, small encounters. Passing in the hallway, his hand brushing mine just slightly as we moved past each other. Catching him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. His voice smooth and steady, low enough that it always sent a shiver up my spine when he spoke. You okay? A simple question. An innocent one. But it didn't feel innocent. Not when his eyes lingered. Not when the space between us felt smaller than it should. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading too much into things. But the truth? I liked it. I waited for those moments. And before I even realized it, I started changing. I started paying more attention to how I looked when I left the apartment. Nothing obvious. Nothing too desperate. But I started wearing the jeans that hugged my curves just a little tighter. The tops that made me feel seen instead of ignored. I spent a little longer fixing my hair, letting it fall just right. A hint of perfume, a touch of lip gloss. And when I saw him, I felt it. The shift. The awareness. The tension. It was intoxicating. And terrifying. Because no matter how much I told myself I wasn't crossing a line, that this was harmless, that I was just enjoying the attention, I knew it wasn't true. The moment it became something I anticipated, something I craved, I had already stepped over the edge. And then, one afternoon, the tension peaked. I was leaving my apartment, heading down the hall when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, deliberate. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. But I did anyway. Mr. Edison stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me like he was waiting for something. I swallowed hard. Hey. He took a step closer. Then another. Not enough to be inappropriate, but enough to make my heart slam against my ribs. Then he leaned in. Just slightly. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne. And then, in that deep, steady voice, he whispered, "You don't have to struggle, you know. I can take care of you, just say the word." My pulse jumped. I let out a nervous laugh, too breathy, too forced. That's not funny. But he didn't laugh. He just stood there, waiting. Watching. Like he already knew what my answer would be. And the worst part? So did I. Rent was due tomorrow. There was no miracle coming. No unexpected deposit, no last-minute job offer, no help from Festus. Just an empty bank account and a landlord who had already made his offer. I stared at my phone, heart pounding, reading the text over and over again. Meet me tonight. We'll talk. A simple message. But I knew what it meant. I gripped the phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could ignore it. Pretend I never saw it. Find some other way. But there was no other way. And I wasn't sure I wanted there to be. I told myself this was survival. That it was about keeping a roof over my head. That I was only considering this because I had no choice. But deep down, I knew better. I wasn't just desperate. I was lonely. I was angry. At Festus, for making me feel like I didn't exist. At myself, for still holding on to hope that he would wake up one day and remember that he loved me. Would he even care? If he found out? If I told him right now that I was about to walk into another man's apartment? No. I already knew the answer. I should say no. I should walk away. I should go home, crawl into bed, and accept my reality. But I didn't. Instead, I typed 2 words. I'm coming. Then I deleted them. Then I typed them again. And this time I hit send. That night, I stood outside Mr. Edison's door, staring at the dark wood, my fist hovering just inches from the surface. Everything inside me screamed to turn around. To go home. To pretend this night never happened. To tell myself I wasn't this kind of woman. But my hand didn't move. And neither did my feet. Because I was this kind of woman now. Whether I wanted to admit it or not. I raised my fist and knocked. Slow. Soft. Like I wasn't sure I wanted him to hear it. But he did. The door opened, inch by inch, and there he stood. Mr. Edison. His expression unreadable. Like he was waiting to see what I would do next. Like this was my decision. And maybe that's what made it worse. Because it was. I could still leave. Still walk away. But instead, I stepped inside. And the door closed behind me. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. My body felt heavy, my skin still warm from a night I shouldn't have had. For a moment, just a moment, I kept my eyes closed, pretending I was waking up in my own bed. Pretending everything was normal. Pretending I hadn't just crossed a line I could never uncross. But reality hit fast. The quiet hum of an unfamiliar room. The weight of guilt pressing into my chest. The smell of him lingering in the air. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Mr. Edison lying beside me, his broad chest rising and falling in steady breaths. And that's when it hit me. What I had done. What I had become. I sat up too fast, my breath catching. My hands shook as I reached for my clothes, as if dressing myself could undo everything that had happened. I needed to leave. I needed to get home. I needed to pretend this never happened. But as I moved to slip out of the bed, his voice stopped me. Low. Calm. Knowing. Leaving already? I froze. I didn't answer. Couldn't. He didn't push. He just exhaled, slow and deep, before shifting beneath the covers. You don't have to sneak out, Emily. I swallowed hard. I forced my voice to stay steady. I should go. A pause. Then, I'll see you around. Simple words. But the way he said them made my stomach twist. Because they weren't a question. They were a statement. Like he knew I'd be back. Like I knew I'd be back. I didn't say another word. I just grabbed my things and left. By the time I stepped into my apartment, the guilt had settled in deep, curling around my ribs like a vice. I shut the door behind me, pressing my forehead against the wood. My hands trembled. My pulse was still racing. I needed to breathe. I needed to think. I needed to look at myself. Slowly, I walked to the mirror, the floor creaking beneath my unsteady steps. And when I finally lifted my head, when I finally met my own reflection, I hated what I saw. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her lips were swollen, her skin flushed, her eyes holding a darkness that hadn't been there before. I had done it. I had betrayed my marriage. Betrayed myself. And for what? A night of feeling wanted? A moment of pretending I wasn't just some invisible, forgotten woman? I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the shame away. But it was too late. Because now I had secrets of my own. Festus was in the living room when I walked out. Same place as always. Same position. Phone in hand, scrolling through whatever mattered more to him than I did. I waited for something. For him to look at me. To notice. To ask where I had been. But he didn't. He didn't even lift his head. I felt sick. I had done the worst thing a wife could do. And my husband still didn't care. I could have spent the whole night in another man's bed, and he wouldn't have even noticed. Wouldn't have even suspected. I wanted him to feel it, to see it, To look me in the eyes and know that I had broken us the way he had broken me. But he didn't. He just sat there, distant as ever. And somehow, that hurt worse than what I had done. Later that day, I ran into Mr. Edison again. It was different now. I knew it. He knew it. But when I saw him, he acted as if nothing had changed. No secret glances. No knowing smirks. Just a simple nod, a casual, "How's your day?" like last night had never even happened. And maybe that should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because when I looked into his eyes, there was something there. Something unspoken. And then, his next words made my blood run cold. "You sure he doesn't know?" My stomach dropped. My pulse jumped. I blinked, my throat suddenly dry. "What?" He shrugged, casual. "Too casual. Your husband. You sure he doesn't know?" Panic clawed its way up my chest. Did he know something? Had he seen something? Was Festus paying more attention than I thought? I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Because for the first time since last night, I was terrified. I told myself it was just once. A mistake. A lapse in judgment. I repeated it over and over in my head like a prayer, like a desperate attempt to convince myself that I could walk away from this. But deep down, I knew the truth. The line was crossed, and nothing would ever feel the same again. I carried it with me, in my skin, in my breath, in the way my body still reacted when I thought about that night. And worst of all, a part of me had liked it. Not just the way Mr. Edison touched me, not just the way he made me feel wanted again, but the power of it. The knowledge that, for the first time in years, I was the one keeping a secret. I was the one living a double life. I wasn't just the woman who got ignored. I wasn't just the wife who sat in the background while her husband scrolled his phone. I was something else now. Something dangerous. Something reckless. And I didn't know how to stop. For the next few days, I did everything I could to go back to normal. I avoided Mr. Edison. I stayed inside as much as possible. When I had to leave the apartment, I walked fast, kept my head down, ignored the weight of his eyes whenever I passed him in the hall. But it didn't change anything. Because he knew. And worse? I knew. It was only a matter of time. The moment came faster than I expected. I had just finished grocery shopping when I saw him waiting by the front entrance. My stomach twisted. I gripped my bags tighter and walked past him, pretending not to see him. But then Emily. My name. Not Mrs. Roberts. Not ma'am. Just Emily. I stopped. I shouldn't have stopped. I turned, my pulse hammering. "What?" He smiled. Not a grin. Not amusement. Just a slow, knowing expression, like we shared a secret no one else could understand. "You've been avoiding me." I swallowed. "No, I haven't." A lie. He tilted his head slightly, watching me. "You sure?" Silence. I hated how he did that. How he let pauses hang in the air, stretching them just long enough to make me nervous. I shifted my weight. "What do you want?" His eyes flickered toward my hands. The bags. The groceries I had somehow afforded. Because rent was taken care of now. Because he had taken care of it. "You know what I want, Emily." My breath hitched. I gripped the bags so hard my fingers ached. That was a mistake. He didn't even blink. Was it? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. I should have felt disgusted. I should have felt trapped. But all I felt was heat crawling up my spine. Because I had already started to fall. And I didn't know how to stop. What would you have done in my position? Was it desperation? Survival? Or was it something deeper? I keep asking myself that. Over and over. Trying to make sense of it. Trying to understand how I became this woman. I thought I was strong. I thought I was the kind of person who knew right from wrong, who would never cross that line. But the truth is, you never really know who you are until life pushes you to the edge. Until the loneliness becomes unbearable. Until the silence in your home feels louder than any argument ever could. Until someone looks at you like you still exist. I never wanted to be this person. But I was. And now, I don't know if I'll ever come back from it. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have given in like I did? Let's talk in the comments. I want to hear your honest thoughts. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: loneliness can push you into dangerous places. Be careful what you risk, because you might never find your way back. And if you think this was shocking, trust me, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga for more true stories that will leave you speechless.